Next up, we're going to talk about some skin derivatives, and these are different types of tissue that are produced from epidermis and are often located in the dermis, and that serve a variety of modified functions for the integumentary system. So we're going to be talking about things like hairs and hair follicles. We're going to talk about different types of glands, like sweat glands and something else called sebaceous glands. And we're also going to briefly discuss nails and what they're all about. So let's go ahead and look first at hair. And before we talk about the structural components of hair, I want to very briefly tell you about the different types of hair. There are three main types of hair. Lanugo, this one right here, is a type of hair that it's really thin and fine. It doesn't have any melanin or any other kind of pigment in it, and it's usually associated with fetuses. This is kind of a hair that's found on fetuses. Villus hair is found on children and women, and it too is a very fine, thin, unpigmented type of hair. By comparison, terminal hair is the kind of hair that we associate with places like the hair on our scalp. It can grow much longer, it tends to be much coarser or thicker in width, and it always has pigment associated with it, and well, at least until you get old and you start getting gray hair instead. So those are three types of hairs, and let me just talk about the different zones of keratinized cells that make up the hair. Now you'll remember I told you before in the last lecture, part of this lecture, that the bottom or the bulb of a hair is found deep in the dermis, and that's because the epidermis actually dips down into the dermis like this. And at the base here, actually this would be the dermis right here, if I were going to draw this correctly. I'm sorry, this would be the stratum basale right here immediately adjacent to the dermis. And this is the location where we have those regenerative cells whose job it is to undergo mitosis and produce lots and lots and lots of keratinocytes, cells full of keratin. And those cells full of keratin become very tightly packed together and are responsible for making up the bulb down here of the hair. Okay, so the bulb is located down at where the stratum basale has dipped way down into the dermis, and this is where we first begin to produce the hair. Then as those keratinocytes are pushed towards the surface of the skin, the lumen would be way up here, they become what's called the root of the hair. Okay, so here we've got the root of the hair in this area, and it has a connective tissue portion to the root and an epithelial portion to the root, but we're not going to worry too much about that. By the time we get out further, when we actually exit the surface of the epidermis, then we have what is actually called the shaft of the hair. So the shaft of the hair is out in the epidermis. The root of the hair is the part that's located in the dermis and the epidermis, and the bulb of the hair is where we actually manufacture the new keratinocytes that make up the hair. Now, there are three layers to a hair, and these include the medulla, that's in the middle, okay, kind of the middle layer here. There's the cortex, which is the outer portion of the hair, and then there's something called the cuticle, and the cuticle is on the very, very surface. It's one layer of kind of scaly looking cells that pack over top or cover over top of the cortex. The cortex, again, are these densely packed keratinocytes that are put together. The medulla, by comparison, is much more loosely arranged cells. There's more space and actually airspace even sometimes present in the medulla. Now, why do I have a picture of a rhinoceros here? Because I'm a biologist, and this is just cool. If you've ever had a chance to get up close and personal with a rhinoceros and touch a rhinoceros horn, you know that it is an extremely hard structure. What you probably don't know is that a rhinoceros horn is nothing but a bunch of extremely tightly packed together hair cells. So this is an example of an uber hair. Okay, this is where we've used lots of structural protein and proteins that serve like a type of glue to solidify all of these components together into an extremely hard horn-like substance, but it is not a horn in the sense of like what we see on a bull, okay, like on a male cow. This is actually tightly packed together hair. Okay, now that we've talked about hair, which is a type of skin derivative, let's take a minute and talk about nails, which is another type of epidermis derivative. It is manufactured from the stratum basale. It's a type of very hard keratinized tissue. So we've packed together lots of keratinocytes extremely tightly together to make a very structurally sound surface. And there are three parts to a nail. There's the root of the nail, and that's located down by the cuticle. In fact, it's just under the cuticle here. That's where the stratum basale is, where all those regenerative cells are manufacturing new keratinocytes. Immediately outside of that, we have what's called the nail body, and that's the part that you can actually see outside the cuticle. And then there's the free edge. That's the part that, if you don't bite them all the time, extends over the tip of your finger. Another term I want to just bring up really quickly is this term cyanosis. Cyanosis is a term we often use to refer to any type of tissue that has a bluish hue to it. For example, if somebody presents in the emergency room and they're not getting enough oxygen, let's say they have really severe pneumonia, or they're a smoker and they've got chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder or something like that, and they are not getting sufficient oxygen, the blood vessels near the surface, underneath the surface of their nails, will have a reduced amount of oxygen content, and because of that, the blood will have more of a purplish bluish hue to it than you would normally see. And you can readily pick that up by looking at a patient's nail beds, because the nail beds are relatively transparent and you can see through them to the underlying epidermis. So when a patient comes into the emergency room, if the nurses and doctor look at the patient and notice that they have a bluish hue to their nail beds, they would say that the patient is cyanotic, and that is an indicator that they're not getting enough oxygen. So the next step is obviously going to be figure out as quickly as possible why they're not getting enough oxygen and correct the situation. The next type of skin derivatives we're going to briefly talk about are all the different types of glands that are found. Primarily, they're situated in the dermis, but they are epidermal derivatives. Okay, so they're made from epidermis tissue, even though they're situated deep to the epidermis in the dermal layer. And there's two main categories of glands we're going to concern ourselves with. Those include sweat glands, and there are a couple different types of sweat glands, and then these other things called sebaceous glands. So let's look at sweat glands first. If my slide will advance, there we go. And among the sweat glands, which are also, by the way, called sudoriferous glands, sometimes you'll hear that term used, the purpose of sweat glands primarily is to serve a cooling function for the body, right? By releasing blood plasma, which is really all sweat is, by releasing this filtrated blood plasma onto the surface of the skin and then allowing that fluid to evaporate into the external environment, we carry heat or dissipate heat away from the body. Now, you may not realize this, but all throughout the day, you are constantly losing fluid in the form of sweat. But normally, this sweat is not perceivable, and we call it insensible sweat for that reason. The only time we normally notice sweat is if it's really hot out, or we've been exercising, or we become very nervous or scared, then you might notice sweat. But even when one of those circumstances is not occurring, you are still producing tiny, undetectable amounts of sweat on the surface of your skin all the time, and it's just evaporating into the environment. Now, there are several different types of sweat glands, and the way that you find sweat glands when you're looking at a picture of the epidermis and dermis, as you see here, you look for little coily-looking organs. They look like a bunch of rope coils all coiled up together, and then it reaches up to the surface. Here's another one right here. That's a very distinctive appearance to most sweat glands. And there are different types of sweat glands depending on the kinds of substances that they actually release. There are what are called merocrine sweat glands, and I'm going to talk about those first. And then in a couple slides, next slide, I'll talk about what are called apocrine sweat glands, and then I'll talk about some other modified types of sweat glands. So merocrine sweat glands are the ones I want to discuss first. You'll sometimes hear these called eccrine sweat glands or eccrine glands. And they are the most common type of sweat gland we find in the body. They're pretty much located all over the surface of the skin, with the exception that we do not see them. They're not present in places like surrounding the nipples, the external genitalia. We see a different kind of gland there, and in the axillary region, in other words, in your armpits. We see a different kind of gland there. Now, primarily what these merocrine glands release onto the surface of the skin is a filtrate of blood plasma. So they basically just take blood plasma, filter it slightly, and release it on the surface of the skin. And it's primarily, the release and production of this type of sweat is primarily controlled by something called your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response that you have when you get nervous or afraid. The other main type of sweat glands are what are called apocrine sweat glands, and these are found in those places where we didn't find the merocrine ones. So these we find in places like axillary regions, external genitalia, groin area, etc. And these types of sweat glands that are found in the armpits and in the groin area are larger. They tend to be larger in size. Okay, they still have kind of a squiggly appearance to them, but they're larger in size, and they primarily make a type of sweat that has a high lipid component to it. So it's still a filtrate of blood, but it has a lot of fatty acids in it. It has some proteins in it. And as it turns out, we have a lot of bacteria that hang out in places like the underarms. And those bacteria absolutely love these lipids that get secreted. And they consume the lipids, and then they produce all these metabolic waste products that we perceive as being very smelly. And that is why we get smelly armpits, for example. It's not your fault. It's the fault of the bacteria that are breaking down the fatty acids, and that's what's actually ultimately causing that odor. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about here, and one other thing to mention with these apocrine glands is that they typically dump their contents into a hair shaft or into a hair follicle. Okay, and then it follows up the hair to the surface of the skin. Okay, now we can talk about our modified types of sweat glands. These are sweat glands that have modified so that they produce a special type of product. Rather than producing just regular old sweat, rather than producing sweat with lipids in it, they serve other functions. For example, mammary glands, which are found in the breast, are responsible for manufacturing a modified type of sweat that we call milk. Yes, it is a modified type of sweat. Another example is ceruminous glands. These are found in your ear canal, and they make that earwax that you find in your ear. And that earwax is pretty effective at inhibiting critters, parasites, bacteria, fungus, etc., from colonizing the inside of the ear. It has a pretty bitter taste to it, and it's very sticky, so it just makes your ear canal a relatively inhospitable place to be. What about sebaceous glands? This is a different category from sweat glands. And sebaceous glands are the type of glands we have to thank for the production of things like pimples. Now, where sweat glands and all the different types of sweat glands are a type of what we call merocrine gland, and they have a particular way in which they get plasma filtrate onto the surface, and that is by the process of exocytosis. Sebaceous glands take a different approach to releasing things onto the surface of the skin. And they are what we call holocrine glands, and by definition, holocrine glands, rather than exocytosing products into a lumen and then having that go out on the surface like we see with merocrine glands, Holocrine glands have the entire or the whole cell break down or break apart into little fragments, and then all of those cellular fragments and debris and all of the lipids and the proteins, et cetera, that were housed inside of that cell then get released onto the surface. And as you might imagine, bacteria find all kinds of wonderful things to consume in these broken down cell fragments, things like lipids and proteins. And again, this can lead to bacteria colonizing near the opening of a holocrine gland. And if that happens and they get blocked underneath the surface of the epidermis, that can lead to the formation of a pimple. So the difference here again, sebaceous glands are a type of holocrine gland where the whole cell breaks down and the cellular debris is released on the surface. That's different from sweat glands, which are merocrine glands, where they exocytose little vesicles filled with blood plasma or blood plasma filtrate or some modified version like milk or ceruminous, that wax substance. So that's the end of all of our skin derivatives. The last thing I'm going to talk about in the next part of this lecture is just some miscellaneous information relevant to the integumentary system.